On 9th of September 1911, in the ballroom of Beechwood on Bellevue Avenue, Newport, the morning light fell in pale strips across polished parquet floors and arrangements of white roses whose perfume filled the air with something almost too sweet. The wedding guests have not yet assembled. Servants move silently through the great rooms, adjusting chairs and checking place cards, their footsteps muffled by carpets that cost more than most families earned in a decade. In a dressing room upstairs, Madeleine Talmadge Force stands before a gilt-frame mirror, her wedding gown a cascade of white satin and Brussels lace, while her mother and sister attend to the final details of her transformation. She is 18 years old. In a widely reproduced photograph from this Newport season, she appears slim and composed, her features arranged in the expression of serene confidence that years of schooling in posture and restraint had perfected, a face trained never to betray uncertainty. Before she steps toward the doors that will lead her down the grand staircase to the ballroom where Colonel John Jacob Astor Forth waits, she smooths the length of one white kid glove, a small, practiced gesture that every debutante knew as intimately as her own heartbeat. Etiquette manuals of the era insisted that gloves be spotless in public and removed discreetly at table. The ritual of pulling them on and off, buttoning and unbuttoning the tiny pearl closures at the wrist, was part costume, part armor, part code. A lady's gloves told observers everything they needed to know about her breeding, her attention to detail, her worthiness for the role she was about to assume. In the Washington Times that August, a society column had already announced what awaited her. 18-year-old Madeleine Force has difficult task ahead, the headline read, noting the scrutiny her marriage to a divorced man nearly 30 years her senior would inevitably bring. To the guests assembled below, the cream of Newport and New York society, those who had received the coveted invitations to witness an Astor wedding, she will appear luminous. The new Mrs. John Jacob Astor, bride of one of the richest men in the world, mistress of mansions on Fifth Avenue and Bellevue Avenue, bearer of a name that had defined American aristocracy for generations. On the marriage certificate signed that afternoon, and in the will that Colonel Astor's lawyers had already drafted, another reality is carefully inked, one in which love, inheritance, and even the right to marry again are precisely priced, conditional, revocable. The gloves she wears look weightless, mere accessories to bridal splendor. They are not. On 19th June 1893, in the fashionable Brooklyn neighborhood where shipping fortunes built brownstone mansions and tree-lined streets promised stability and respectability, Madeleine Talmadge Force entered a world already cushioned by capital and social position. Her father, William Hurlbut Force, had built his wealth in the interconnected worlds of shipping and dry goods, industries that move products across oceans and supplied the growing American middle class with the fabrics, furnishings, and imported luxuries that signified arrival in an age of rapid industrial expansion. His business dealings connected him to networks of merchants and financiers whose names appeared in shipping manifests and bank ledgers, men who understood that commerce was the engine driving America's transformation from agrarian republic to industrial empire. Her mother, Catherine Arvilla Talmadge, brought to the marriage a Brooklyn political lineage stretching back through generations of civic prominence and public service. Her grandfather was Tunis 5P Talmadge, a name that commanded respect in local Democratic circles, and the family tree included Thomas G. Talmadge, a former mayor whose political career had demonstrated that Dutch reform propriety and municipal ambition could coexist comfortably in the better Brooklyn households. The Talmadge connection gave the Force family something that money alone could not purchase, a pedigree rooted in the city's history, a claim to belonging that predated the new fortunes rising all around them. The household into which Madeleine was born reflected these combined inheritances of commercial success and social standing. The family residence occupied a respectable address in a neighborhood where similar brownstones housed similar families. Merchants and professionals whose comfortable circumstances placed them firmly in the upper reaches of the middle class, if not quite in the rarefied atmosphere of the Astors and Vanderbilts whose Fifth Avenue mansions defined true aristocratic wealth. Oil lamps cast their warm glow across rooms furnished with thick Persian carpets, imported through the very trade networks that supported the family's prosperity. Mahogany sideboards displayed the imported china that announced refined taste to every dinner guest. The walls held portraits and landscapes in gilded frames. The windows were dressed in heavy velvet curtains that kept out drafts and the curious gazes of passers-by. It was a world of solidity and order, of predictable rhythms and clear expectations. This domestic comfort was maintained by a staff of servants whose labor made possible the appearance of effortless elegance that the Force family presented to visitors and to themselves. Cooks prepared elaborate meals in basement kitchens. Maids dusted and polished and changed linens. A butler or footman answered the door and announced callers. Their presence was essential to the household's functioning, yet the conventions of the era rendered them nearly invisible in family photographs and social accounts. The polished silver that gleamed on the sideboard, the pressed linens that covered every bed, the spotless windows through which Brooklyn's filtered light entered the parlor. All these testified to hands that worked while the family slept or socialized, hands that remained invisible in the finished portrait of genteel life. Photographs from around 1908, when Madeleine was 15, show her and her older sister Catherine posed in white dresses against carefully arranged backdrops. Perhaps a garden wall dappled with climbing roses. Perhaps a studio setting designed to suggest outdoor leisure. Their expressions carry the composed stillness expected of upper-class girls who had already learned that the camera was not merely recording but evaluating, that every image was a social document to be judged by standards they were only beginning to understand. The dresses are simple but exquisitely made, the fabric crisp and white, suggesting purity and careful maintenance. Their hair is arranged with studied casualness, as if it had fallen naturally into becoming waves rather than being pinned and curled by patient hands. Their posture is erect without appearing rigid, the result of countless corrections and reminders that would eventually make good carriage feel natural. Even in childhood photographs, the training is visible. Madeleine grew up understanding, in the wordless way that children absorb the assumptions of their world, that comfort required labor and that labor should never be acknowledged, the seamlessness of domestic life, meals appearing at appointed hours, clothes laid out freshly pressed, rooms always clean and orderly, depended on workers whose presence was simultaneously essential and socially invisible. This was simply how things were, the natural order of a world that rewarded some with leisure and others with service. Early on, the geography of her life both narrowed and expanded in ways that would shape her expectations and opportunities. From Brooklyn drawing rooms where her mother received callers and discussed the small dramas of neighborhood society, she graduated to Manhattan shops where Catherine Force selected fabrics and trimmings for the family's wardrobes, examining silks and satins with the discriminating eye of a woman who understood that appearances must be carefully constructed. From the rhythm of carriage wheels on cobblestone Brooklyn streets, she moved to the broader avenues of Manhattan, where department stores like Lord & Taylor and later the great emporiums of Ladies' Mile offered endless tutorials in taste and consumption. Summers took the family away from the city's heat to resorts and relatives' homes, introducing Madeleine to the seasonal rhythms that organized wealthy American life, the understanding that different places served different purposes, that one's address shifted with the calendar according to rules everyone who mattered understood. The world into which Madeleine Talmadge Force was born looked secure, almost inevitable, a progression from comfortable childhood through advantageous education to suitable marriage that seemed as natural and predetermined as the seasons themselves. Privilege gave her rooms full of light and servants. To maintain them, wardrobes of carefully chosen clothes and lessons in how to wear them, but also a script already written in other people's hands. The next lesson, the one that would occupy her adolescent years and prepare her for the role she would eventually assume, would be how to perform that script perfectly. By the first decade of the 20th century, the center of Madeleine's daily existence had shifted decisively from Brooklyn to Manhattan, where she attended first Miss Ely's school and then the more prestigious Miss Spence's school for girls on West 48th Street. These institutions occupied a particular niche in the educational landscape of the era, serving the daughters of New York's wealthiest and most socially ambitious families. Girls whose futures would unfold not in offices or laboratories, but in drawing rooms and ballrooms, whose education aimed not at professional achievement, but at the demanding amateur career of society wife, mother, and hostess. The schools clustered in Midtown Manhattan existed as finishing stations on the journey from privileged childhood to advantageous marriage. Their curricula combined academic subjects, enough intellectual content to produce a woman capable of intelligent conversation, with intensive training in the social graces that would determine a young woman's success in the marriage market as surely as her family's fortune or her face. The daughters of bankers and industrialists, shipping magnates and real estate developers, sat together in classrooms where French verbs and historical dates shared time with lessons in deportment, correspondence, and the intricate etiquette that governed every aspect of upper-class social interaction. At Miss Spence's school, Madeleine proved herself what one contemporary description called an especially brilliant pupil, quick in languages and at ease in the drawing-room conversation that was itself a demanding performance art requiring wit, knowledge, and exquisite sensitivity to social boundaries. She studied French with the careful attention to accent and idiom that would allow her to navigate Parisian salons, converse with European aristocrats, and order confidently in continental restaurants, skills that marked a woman as truly sophisticated, as at home in the great capitals of Europe as in the drawing rooms of New York. She read literature and history, learning the references and allusions that peppered cultured conversation, enough knowledge to recognize a quotation from Shakespeare or Tennyson, to discuss the French Revolution or the Congress of Vienna, to appear informed without appearing pedantic or, worse, intellectual. She took lessons in music and art, developing the accomplishments that a society hostess would display at her own gatherings. Piano pieces to be performed for guests after dinner, watercolors, and sketches that demonstrated refined taste and patient skill. These accomplishments were not meant to lead to careers as concert pianists or professional artists. Such ambitions would have been considered inappropriate, even shameful, for a girl of her station. Rather, they served as evidence of cultivation, markers of the leisure time and careful training that distinguished upper-class women from those who had to work for their living. But woven through these academic and artistic subjects was another curriculum entirely, one that rarely appeared in school catalogs, but constituted perhaps the most important element of elite girls' education: the physical and social training that would transform a girl into a lady. At Spence and similar institutions, young women learned to move through the world in ways that announced their breeding before they spoke a word. The Spence curriculum of the early 20th century echoed the approach of similar elite institutions scattered across the Northeast and Europe. Miss Porter's school in Farmington, Connecticut, trained young women in the same combination of academic subjects and social polish. European finishing schools in Switzerland and Paris, in the German spa towns where wealthy Americans sent daughters for a final continental gloss, offered intensive immersion in languages and deportment. The common thread linking all these institutions was the understanding that education for upper-class girls meant not preparation for independence, but refinement for marriage. Young women at Spence practiced the art of correspondence as meticulously as they practiced piano scales. They learned to select stationery appropriate to each occasion: cream-colored sheets for formal notes, lighter paper for intimate friends, cards of specific dimensions for leaving after social calls. They learned to compose notes of thanks and condolence, acceptance and regret in language that was warm without being effusive, formal without being cold, expressing precisely the degree of feeling appropriate to each relationship and circumstance. The penmanship itself was a form of self-presentation. Letters written in a cramped or careless hand suggested a cramped or careless character, while flowing, elegant script testified to patience, discipline, and the leisure time required to perfect such accomplishments. Physical training was as rigorous as intellectual instruction. Students walked through the school's hallways with books balanced on their heads, a technique borrowed from European deportment schools, training their spines into the straight, lifted carriage that signified good breeding, A lady's posture revealed her upbringing as clearly as her accent or her wardrobe. Slumped shoulders or a forward thrust head marked a woman as poorly trained, unsuitable for the best society, regardless of her family's wealth. The young women practiced sitting and rising with grace, entering and exiting rooms without awkwardness, descending staircases with the floating quality that suggested ease rather than effort. Glove etiquette alone required hours of instruction and as practice. A lady's gloves were removed at the table but never placed on the table itself. They were held in the lap or tucked beside one on the chair, invisible but accessible. Gloves were buttoned with a special hook, never with one's teeth, a mark of vulgarity that no amount of money could excuse. They were kept immaculately clean, replaced at the first sign of soil or wear, always matching in color and quality to the rest of one's ensemble. The simple act of smoothing a glove, running one's fingers along the seam to ensure a perfect fit, adjusting the tiny buttons at the wrist, became a kind of semaphore, a gesture that communicated self-possession and attention to detail, visible and meaningful to those who knew how to read such codes, invisible to those who did not. Her mother, Catherine Force, supplemented this formal education with practical instruction in the wider world of upper-class consumption and display. She took Madeleine and her sister Catherine abroad repeatedly during these years, touring Europe several times, as later biographical accounts noted, introducing them to the museums and galleries, grand hotels, and fashionable promenades, where wealthy Americans demonstrated their sophistication and cultural attainment. In Paris and London, Rome and Vienna, they learned that American wealth could open doors throughout the world, but that entry required the proper costume and script. They visited the Louvre and the National Gallery, studying the masterpieces that educated people were expected to recognize and discuss. They stayed in hotels where the staff understood how to serve American money while maintaining European standards of elegance. They walked the boulevards and parks where society displayed itself, learning to see and be seen according to rules that governed international elite culture. Archival descriptions of Spence students from this era repeatedly emphasize qualities like poise and self-possession, words that suggest inner confidence and personal strength, but in practice describe something closer to rehearsed composure, the ability to maintain a controlled and pleasing exterior regardless of inner turmoil. A lady never rushed, never raised her voice, never allowed her face to betray annoyance or distress or excessive enthusiasm. She moved through the world as if floating, as if the physical constraints of corsets and long skirts and elaborate hair arrangements posed no impediment whatsoever to her grace. This appearance of effortless ease required enormous effort, hours of practice, constant self-monitoring, the systematic suppression of any impulse that might disturb the polished surface. Every corrected shoulder, every carefully inked note on cream-colored stationery, every smooth adjustment of a glove prepared Madeleine not simply to be admired but to be read by families evaluating potential daughters-in-law, by suitors assessing potential wives, by newspaper correspondents who tracked the movements and marriages of the wealthy with obsessive attention. The education she received at Miss Spence's and in her mother's careful tutelage was preparation for a very particular kind of life. One lived under constant observation, where every gesture carried meaning and every choice invited judgment. The audience for her performance was about to expand beyond schoolrooms and drawing rooms, beyond the familiar circles of Brooklyn and Manhattan society. Soon the whole country would be watching. By the summer seasons of the early 1910s, the axis of American high society ran through Newport, Rhode Island, along the stretch of Bellevue Avenue where marble facades and meticulously maintained lawns formed a seasonal stage for the nation's wealthiest families. For approximately 8 weeks each summer, from late June through August, the great cottages that lined this famous street filled with their owners and their guests, and the social calendar became a relentless sequence of dinners and balls, tennis matches and yachting excursions, afternoon teas and evening musicals. The pace was exhausting, the stakes impossibly high. Decisions made under gaslight and chandelier during those brief summer weeks could shape fortunes and family names for generations, cementing alliances or creating enmities that would echo through the social world for decades. Newport's position as the supreme arbiter of American social standing had been established in the decades following the Civil War, when newly wealthy industrialists sought summer retreats from the heat and commerce of New York City. What began as modest summer homes gradually transformed into architectural extravagances that rivaled and sometimes exceeded the great estates of European aristocracy. The term cottage applied to these mansions was a piece of social theater in itself, an ironic understatement that everyone understood. The cottages of Bellevue Avenue contained dozens of rooms, employed armies of servants, and cost millions of dollars to build and maintain. The Astor family's mansion Beechwood stood at 580 Bellevue Avenue, its grounds sweeping down toward the Atlantic Ocean, its interiors designed by the most fashionable architects and decorators of the era to impress and intimidate visitors. The house had been rebuilt and substantially enlarged by Richard Morris Hunt, the same architect responsible for the Vanderbilt's palatial breakers nearby and for many of the grandest private residences in America. Hunt understood how to translate European aristocratic splendor into American terms, creating homes that announced their owners' wealth and taste with unmistakable clarity. Beechwood's ballroom had served for decades as the stage for Carolyn Schermerhorn Astor's legendary gatherings, the entertainments that defined the boundaries of acceptable society and gave rise to the famous concept of the 400. According to social legend, Mrs. Astor's ballroom could accommodate exactly 400 guests, and this physical limitation was said to have determined the size of New York's true social elite. Whether or not the arithmetic was precise, the concept captured something real about the exclusivity that Carolyn Astor enforced with iron determination. To be invited to Beechwood was to be acknowledged as a member of society's innermost circle. To be excluded was social death. Mrs. Astor had died in 1908, her final years clouded by mental decline that had gradually loosened her grip on the social machinery she had so long controlled. But the house and the name retained their power to confer or deny social standing, and the summer seasons at Newport continued according to the rhythms she had established. Her son, Colonel John Jacob Astor IV, now controlled Beechwood and the vast fortune that sustained it, though his recent divorce had complicated his own social position in ways that Mrs. Astor would certainly have deplored. Newport's summer cottages competed with each other in scale and spectacle with an intensity that sometimes approached open warfare. The Vanderbilt's breakers, completed in 1895, contained 70 rooms spread across 5 floors, its interiors executed by European craftsmen imported specifically for the project. Its great hall rising 2 stories beneath a painted ceiling that evoked Renaissance palaces. Marble House, built by William K. Vanderbilt as a birthday present for his wife Alva, had cost approximately $11 million, a staggering sum in an era when skilled workers earned perhaps $2 a day, and featured a gold room whose decoration consciously imitated the Palace of Versailles. Rosecliff, Rough Point, Chateau-sur-Mer, Kingscote, each mansion announced its owner's wealth and taste through architecture, decoration, and the endless social entertainments that summer required. The society pages of newspapers across the country covered Newport's summer season with the intensity that later generations would devote to Hollywood celebrities or professional athletes. Correspondents stationed in the resort filed daily dispatches tracking arrivals and departures, describing entertainments and wardrobes, speculating about romances and rivalries. Readers in small towns throughout America followed these accounts with fascination, learning the names of families whose wealth exceeded comprehension and imagining lives of unimaginable luxury and leisure. These society columns read like intelligence reports, documenting movements and relationships with meticulous attention to detail: who dined at which cottage, who danced with whom at the casino ball, whose yachts were anchored in the harbor, whose gowns attracted admiration and whose invited criticism. All these matters received careful coverage and analysis. The correspondents understood that their readers craved not just information but narrative, and they constructed ongoing storylines tracking courtships and engagements, feuds and reconciliations, the rise of new families and the decline of old ones. In this world, a young woman's charm and accomplishment were simultaneously personal qualities and family assets, forms of capital to be deployed strategically in the pursuit of advantageous alliances. A beautiful daughter, properly educated and gracefully presented, could attract suitors whose wealth and position might elevate an entire family's standing. The marriage market operated according to rules that everyone understood, but few discussed openly. Families sought to improve their positions through unions that combined compatible fortunes, complementary social connections, and sufficient personal attraction to make the arrangement endurable. Madeleine Force's entry into New York society came through the expected channels: participation in the Junior League and its charitable activities, which brought together young women of appropriate background in settings where they could meet each other and be observed by the mothers who supervised the marriage market. She appeared in amateur theatrical productions, plays and tableaux vivants, mounted in private ballrooms and hotel function rooms, where young women could display their grace, their poise, their ability to project charm and self-possession to an audience. She participated in yachting excursions, where families mingled in the enforced intimacy of deck chairs and dining saloons, and where the easy manners appropriate to shipboard life allowed for interactions that more formal settings might have prohibited. Contemporary accounts describe her as accomplished in writing, a skill that combined physical mastery with elegant presentation, requiring both athletic ability and the kind of composure that kept a woman looking graceful while controlling a large and potentially dangerous animal. She was praised repeatedly as bright and good with drawing room conversation, the formula that signified success in this particular marketplace. She could discuss the topics that interested educated people, could respond to witticisms with wit of her own, could navigate the conversational shoals of upper-class social life without giving offense or appearing either dull or inappropriately clever. By 1910, these carefully orchestrated activities had placed Madeleine Force within sight of the Astor orbit, within the social circles where Colonel John Jacob Astor IV appeared at dinners and regattas and Newport gatherings. His recent divorce from Ava Lowell Willing, a beautiful and prominent woman from an old Philadelphia family, had been the subject of intense speculation and disapproval, but his fortune and position meant that he remained a figure of fascination wherever he appeared. The Newport ballrooms shimmered with candles and silk, but behind every invitation and every introduction lay arithmetic, calculations of lineage and income, assessments of character and prospects, the strategic placement of daughters where they might catch the attention of eligible men. One of those daughters was about to catch the most eligible and most controversial attention in American society. In classrooms on West 48th Street during the years around 1907 through 1910, Madeleine Force's days unfolded according to a precise and demanding rhythm that left little room for idleness, daydreaming, or independent thought. The schedule at Miss Spence's school organized time into discrete blocks devoted to specific subjects and activities, each building toward the finished product the school aimed to produce: a young woman equipped for the particular kind of life that awaited wealthy American girls. French recitations occupied the morning hours, when minds were fresh and concentration came most easily. The language was not merely an academic subject but a social necessity. French remained the language of international diplomacy and aristocratic society, and a woman who could not converse fluently in French revealed herself as provincial, inadequately prepared for the cosmopolitan world she aspired to join. Students practiced pronunciation until their accents passed for native, memorized irregular verbs and idiomatic expressions, and read passages from French literature that would provide conversational material for decades. The goal was not scholarly mastery, but social fluency, the ability to speak, understand, and respond without hesitation or embarrassment in any setting where French might be required. Literature and history filled the afternoon hours, providing the cultural foundation that educated conversation required. Young women read English and American classics, discussed historical events and their significance, learned to formulate and express opinions within the bounds of appropriate feminine modesty. The point was not to produce scholars or critics, but to ensure that graduates could hold their own in discussions that ranged across centuries and continents, could recognize references and allusions, could demonstrate the breadth of cultivation that distinguished ladies from mere women of wealth. Piano and writing lessons came in the late afternoon, rounding out a curriculum designed to produce accomplishment without ambition. A lady played piano well enough to entertain guests after dinner, to demonstrate sensitivity and refinement, but not so well as to suggest professional aspirations. She rode well enough to participate in the hunts and equestrian activities that occupied country weekends, but competition and excellence for their own sake were considered unfeminine. The goal in all these accomplishments was graceful competence, the appearance of ease that masked years of diligent practice. The Spence School's approach to education reflected broader patterns visible throughout elite girls' institutions of the era. From Miss Porter's in Connecticut to the finishing schools of Switzerland, similar curricula combined intellectual content with social training, producing young women who could discuss literature and history while also managing a household, entertaining guests, and navigating the complex social obligations of upper-class life. The common assumption underlying all these programs was that education for wealthy young women meant preparation not for independence or career, but for marriage, for a lifetime of managing homes, raising children, and performing the demanding social role of society hostess. The physical dimensions of this education were as demanding as the intellectual content. Students learned to move through space in ways that announced their breeding before they spoke a word. They practiced walking with books balanced on their heads, training their spines into perfect vertical alignment, their shoulders back and down, their chins slightly lifted. A lady's carriage, the way she held herself, the way she moved, revealed her upbringing as clearly as her accent or her wardrobe. The hours spent walking back and forth across schoolroom floors, concentrating on keeping those books from falling, produced a physical self-consciousness that became second nature, a constant awareness of one's body and its presentation to observers. Young women practiced sitting and rising with grace, the movements that seemed simple but required careful attention to avoid awkwardness. Rising from a chair required engaging the legs without appearing to strain, keeping the back straight, avoiding the graceless lurch that marked the untrained. Sitting down meant arranging skirts smoothly, settling without flopping, maintaining erect posture even in repose, entering and exiting rooms, ascending and descending staircases, getting in and out of carriages. Each movement was rehearsed until it appeared effortless, until the artifice became invisible. Correspondence occupied a special place in the curriculum, recognized as both a practical skill and an art form that revealed character. Students learned to select stationery appropriate to each occasion, the weight and color of paper, the size of cards, the style of engraving that announced one's taste and position. They practiced composing notes of thanks and congratulation, condolence and regret, learning the formulas appropriate to each circumstance and the degrees of warmth or formality suitable for different relationships. The handwriting itself received careful attention, clear and elegant, neither cramped nor sprawling, consistent enough to be recognizable as one's own. The simple act of managing gloves, pulling them on and off, buttoning and unbuttoning, knowing when to wear them and when to remove them, required knowledge that etiquette manuals attempted to codify, but that true mastery came only from practice and observation. Gloves were worn outdoors and in public spaces, removed for dining, kept on during formal receiving, but removed when actually shaking hands in some circumstances. The buttons at the wrist, tiny pearl or bone closures that required a special hook to fasten, demanded dexterity and patience. Smoothing a glove, adjusting its fit, occupied the hands during moments of social anxiety and demonstrated the wearer's attention to detail and personal grooming. Archival descriptions of Spence students from this era repeatedly emphasize qualities like poise and self-possession, words that might suggest inner confidence and emotional stability. but in practice describe something closer to performance, the trained ability to project calmness and control regardless of inner experience. A lady never allowed her face to betray strong emotion, neither excessive joy nor obvious distress, neither anger nor passionate enthusiasm. She maintained a pleasant, serene expression that gave nothing away, that protected her inner life from observation while presenting a surface that invited approval. This education was preparing Madeline Force not merely to be admired, though admiration was certainly part of the goal, but to be read, interpreted, evaluated by audiences who understood the codes she was learning to perform. Families assessing potential daughters-in-law would observe her behavior for signs of good breeding or its absence. Suitors would evaluate her accomplishments and manner as evidence of what kind of wife and mother she might become. Newspaper correspondents, already beginning to notice her presence at social events, would describe her appearance and behavior for readers who consumed such accounts with fascination. The audience for her performance was expanding with each passing season. Soon, the scrutiny would become intense enough to shape the rest of her life. By the late 1900s and into 1910, Madeleine had graduated from the structured environment of the classroom to the equally demanding and considerably more public arena of society performance. The lessons learned at Miss Spence's school now required practical application in settings where mistakes carried real consequences. Not failing grades, but social embarrassment. Not detention, but exclusion from the circles where her future would be determined. Society reports from these years document her appearances with increasing frequency and detail. She participated in junior league theatrical productions, the amateur plays and tableaux vivants that brought together young women of appropriate background in performances that served multiple purposes simultaneously. These entertainments raised money for charitable causes, providing the philanthropic cover that justified social gatherings in an era when leisure for its own sake seemed vaguely disreputable. They allowed young women to display themselves, their beauty, their grace, their ability to project personality across a room full of observers, in settings that were socially sanctioned and carefully supervised, and they provided occasions for the daughters of prominent families to be seen by potential suitors and their scrutinizing mothers, who evaluated not just beauty but poise, not just charm but breeding. Under the glow of gaslight chandeliers, in ballrooms and hotel function rooms transformed into temporary theaters, Madeleine learned lessons that went far beyond any script. She discovered how to enter a room in ways that drew attention without appearing to seek it, how to pause at a doorway just long enough to allow observers to register her presence, how to move through a crowd so that conversation seemed to swell toward her rather than recede. These were skills that could not be taught directly, but only absorbed through observation and practice, through the painful trial and error of social experience. She mastered the subtle art of glove management in public settings. The timing of removal before tea, too early suggested nervous anticipation, too late suggested uncertainty about proper form, had to be calibrated precisely. The manner of removal mattered as well. Graceful, unhurried, the movements of someone so accustomed to these rituals that they required no conscious thought. The precise degree of eye contact that signaled interest without crossing into impropriety required constant awareness, constant adjustment based on whom she was addressing, who might be observing, what message she wished to send. These social performances served as examinations in which young women were tested, not on their knowledge, but on their being, their physical presence, their manner, their ability to embody the ideals of feminine refinement that their class demanded. The audience included not just the young men who might become suitors, but the older women who controlled access to the best social circles, who issued the invitations that could make or break a young woman's prospects. One unfortunate gesture, one moment of awkwardness or impropriety, could provide ammunition for gossip that would follow a girl for seasons afterward. Newspaper coverage of New York society amplified these stakes enormously. The columns that tracked social events and the young women who attended them created a kind of public record, transforming private social performances into narratives that readers across the country followed with fascination. A face glimpsed in a society photograph, perhaps at a charity ball, perhaps at the opera, became a character in an ongoing story, someone whose subsequent appearances readers would notice and discuss. To be covered in these columns was both an honor and an exposure, a mark of arrival that simultaneously surrendered the privacy that less prominent families could still enjoy. Madeleine's name began appearing in society coverage with increasing frequency as the decade progressed. Her presence at events noted alongside descriptions of her dress, her companions, her demeanor. Fashion writers analyzed her choices of gown and ornament. Social correspondents tracked whom she danced with and whom she sat beside at dinner. She was becoming, incrementally but unmistakably, a public figure, not through any achievement of her own ambition, but simply by being visible, eligible, appropriately bred for the role that society expected her to play. Contemporary accounts describe her as accomplished in the skills that mattered in this particular marketplace. Her writing drew praise, not merely competent, but elegant, demonstrating the physical poise and self-command that hours in the saddle developed. Her conversation was noted as bright and engaging, quick enough to hold interest without crossing into the aggressive wit that might intimidate potential suitors or offend their mothers. She moved through social spaces with the ease that years of training had produced, performing her role so naturally that the performance itself became invisible. By the time Colonel John Jacob Astor IV began appearing at events where she was present, Madeleine Force was no longer merely a private daughter practicing drawing room skills in preparation for an as yet undetermined future. She had become a public script in progress, a narrative that readers followed and society watched with interest. The next act would be written not just in drawing rooms, but in headlines, not just witnessed by a few hundred members of the social elite, but consumed by millions of newspaper readers who would form opinions about a young woman they would never meet. The next act would make her famous. In 1910 and continuing into 1911, Colonel John Jacob Jack Astor IV, hotel magnate, real estate baron, inventor, author, and veteran of the Spanish-American War, began appearing at Madeleine Force's side with a frequency that society observers immediately noted and interpreted. They were seen together on automobile drives through Manhattan and along the roads of Long Island's wealthy enclaves. They appeared together at yacht excursions where the enforced proximity of shipboard life invited speculation about developing intimacy. They walked together, dined together, attended entertainments together, their repeated appearances accumulating into a pattern that only the most naive could interpret innocently. The courtship was conducted in full public view, every appearance documented by correspondents whose readers demanded such intelligence, every gesture analyzed by observers who considered themselves experts in the meaning of social behavior. Colonel Astor was 47 years old in 1910, one of the richest men in America, and among the best known. His fortune derived from generations of Astor enterprise, the fur trading that had established the family's wealth in the early republic, the Manhattan real estate acquisitions that had multiplied that wealth as the city expanded, the hotels and other ventures that bore the Astor name. He owned or controlled properties whose total value approached or exceeded $100 million at a time when such sums were almost incomprehensible. His great-grandfather John Jacob Astor had been the richest man in America at his death in 1848. The family had maintained and expanded that position across subsequent generations. But Colonel Astor carried more than wealth. He carried complication. He was recently divorced from Ava Lowell Willing, his first wife, after a marriage of nearly 20 years that had produced 2 children, Vincent, his son and heir, and Ava, a daughter named for her mother. The divorce had been finalized in 1909 after years of rumored unhappiness and separation, and its terms had been the subject of intense speculation in the press and in drawing rooms. Ava Willing Astor had reportedly received a settlement worth millions of dollars, and legal conditions attached to the divorce limited John Jacob's ability to remarry in New York State without court permission, a provision that underscored how seriously law and society treated the dissolution of marriages among the elite. Divorce in this era occupied an ambiguous moral territory. The practice was becoming more common, particularly among the wealthy, but it still carried significant stigma. A divorced man was marked as someone who had failed at the fundamental social institution, whose judgment and character might reasonably be questioned. Some social circles closed against divorced individuals. Some churches refused to marry them. Colonel Astor's wealth and prominence protected him from the worst consequences of his changed status, but they could not entirely insulate him from the disapproval that his divorce had provoked. When this wealthy, divorced, 47-year-old man began appearing repeatedly in public with an 18-year-old debutante barely out of finishing school, the situation transcended private romance and became a kind of public referendum. The age difference alone would have attracted comment. 29 years separated them, nearly a generation. Added to the divorce, the combination became a test case for questions that American society was asking itself with increasing urgency. How much did marriage conventions still matter in a rapidly changing world? Could wealth and position excuse departures from traditional morality? Where did acceptable eccentricity end and genuine scandal begin? Editorials debated the propriety of the match. Drawing rooms buzzed with opinion and speculation. Letters to newspaper editors expressed outrage or defended the couple's right to pursue happiness as they chose. Madeleine's youth made her simultaneously sympathetic and suspect. Sympathetic as a young woman, perhaps swept off her feet by an older man's sophistication and attention. Suspect as someone who might be pursuing his fortune rather than his person. The motivations attributed to her ranged from romantic naivete to calculated gold digging, depending on the observer's predispositions. For Madeleine herself, years of training in controlled expression became essential survival skills. Each time she stepped from carriage to sidewalk in Colonel Astor's company, she faced not just the ordinary social pressures of elite public life, but the extraordinary scrutiny that their relationship had provoked. Photographers waited to capture their appearances together. Correspondents filed reports analyzing their behavior. Readers across the country formed judgments based on details of dress and expression that the newspapers provided. Every adjustment of a glove, every expression that crossed her face, every word she spoke within earshot of observers became evidence in an ongoing public trial. Courtship, for Madeleine Force, was never the private awakening to romantic love that sentimental fiction described. It was instead an extended examination in poise under pressure, a sustained performance before an audience that felt entitled to judge her choices and would remember their verdicts. The next document to define her life would not be a school report or a social column, but a marriage license and the legal and financial instruments that would accompany it. On 3rd August 1911, the Washington Times published a headline that captured the uneasy mixture of fascination and disapproval with which American society regarded Madeleine Force's engagement. 18-year-old Madeleine Force has difficult task ahead. The article detailed what readers of society columns already knew, that the young woman had accepted a proposal of marriage from Colonel John Jacob Astor IV, a man nearly 30 years her senior, whose divorce from his first wife had been finalized barely 2 years earlier, and offered predictions about the challenges she would face as the second Mrs. Astor. The headline was accurate in ways its author perhaps did not fully intend. The difficult task would extend far beyond social acceptance or the management of public opinion. It would follow her across an ocean, into a lifeboat, through widowhood, and into legal conditions that would govern her life for years after her first husband's death. But in August 1911, as engagement announcements appeared and wedding preparations began, the immediate difficulties were public and social rather than legal or maritime. Society columns parsed every detail of the engagement with the minute attention that this world devoted to marriages among the elite. Writers describe Madeleine's appearance at announced events, her gowns, her jewels, her expression, her manner beside her famous fiancé. They quoted unnamed friends and family members, reporting conversations that may or may not have occurred, speculating about the couple's compatibility, predicting success or failure for the union. The engagement became a topic of general discussion, proprietary interest taken by people who had no personal connection to either party but felt entitled to opinions about their choices. The religious dimensions of the marriage presented obstacles that wealth alone could not remove. Colonel Astor was an Episcopalian, as befitting his social position, but his divorce status placed him in an awkward relationship with his church. Episcopal doctrine at the time generally prohibited the remarriage of divorced persons, at least when the former spouse was still living. Several Episcopal priests reportedly declined to perform the ceremony when approached, citing church teaching and their own consciences. The couple eventually secured the services of a Congregationalist minister willing to officiate, a choice that newspapers noted as evidence of both the obstacles they faced and their determination to overcome them. The religious compromise suggested that even the wealthiest Americans could not always have things entirely their own way, that some boundaries remained resistant to the pressure of money and social position. Behind the headlines and society coverage, behind the engagement parties and wedding preparations, lawyers were drafting the documents that would govern Madeleine's financial future far more completely than any wedding vows. Colonel Astor's fortune was vast, but not simple, a complex network of real estate holdings, investments, business interests, and family trusts accumulated across generations of Astor enterprises. The management of this fortune involved not just Colonel Astor himself, but trustees, lawyers, and family members whose interests had to be considered. The prospect of a second wife, young, potentially fertile, potentially productive of children who might claim portions of the estate, required careful legal attention. Marriage settlements, prenuptial agreements, wills, and trust documents began taking shape in law offices far from the ballrooms where the engagement was celebrated. Colonel Astor's existing will would need revision to account for his new marriage. Provisions for Madeleine and any children she might bear had to be balanced against the interests of Vincent and Ava, his children from his first marriage, whose inheritance could not be unduly compromised. The lawyers understood, even if the romantic public did not, that marriage among the wealthy was as much a business transaction as a personal union, requiring careful negotiation of financial terms alongside whatever emotional considerations the parties might feel. The conditions that would later govern Madeleine's widowhood were taking shape in these legal documents even as florists arranged consultations about wedding flowers, even as dressmakers began work on the bridal gown, even as engravers prepared the invitations that would summon Newport society to witness an Astor wedding. The settlement included trusts and provisions whose terms would activate upon Colonel Astor's death, whenever that might occur. No one drafting these documents in the summer of 1911 imagined that death would come so soon, or so dramatically. The provisions were standard estate planning measures, designed to protect family wealth across generations and contingencies, but they would determine Madeleine's options in ways that the August engagement announcements never hinted at. The same newspapers that praised her beauty and composure, that devoted columns to her wardrobe, and her wedding preparations also predicted the burden she was assuming. The difficult task identified in that August headline would not end with the wedding ceremony at Beechwood. It would follow her across the Atlantic on an ill-fated voyage. It would meet her in a lifeboat in the freezing darkness of the North Atlantic. It would await her in the reading of a will whose conditions would shape her choices for years afterward. The glove she wore to her wedding would later grip the gunwale of a lifeboat. The name she assumed at the altar would become part of maritime history. On 9th September 1911, at Beechwood on Bellevue Avenue in Newport, Rhode Island, the long-anticipated wedding of Colonel John Jacob Astor IV and Madeleine Talmadge Force finally took place. The ceremony brought together a carefully selected portion of New York and Newport society in a setting that combined Astor grandeur with the relative intimacy of a private family affair, or as intimate as any occasion involving one of America's wealthiest and most scrutinized families could possibly be. The New York Times covered the event, as did newspapers across the country and around the world. Coverage noted the smaller-than-expected guest list, a reflection, perhaps, of the social complications surrounding the groom's divorce status, or simply the couple's preference for a less public celebration after months of relentless scrutiny. Vincent Astor, Colonel Astor's son from his first marriage, served as his father's best man. a role that proclaimed family unity and acceptance of the new bride despite any reservations that might privately exist. The ceremony took place in the mansion where Mrs. Caroline Astor had once reigned as the supreme arbiter of New York society, where her famous balls had defined the boundaries of the 400, where generations of Astor gatherings had established standards of elegance and exclusivity that the rest of American society could only imitate. The bride wore white, as Victorian tradition demanded, and Edwardian fashion continued to enforce. Her gown was constructed of the finest materials, satin and Brussels lace, fabrics whose quality announced the wealth and taste of the families involved. Fashion writers devoted columns to analyzing every detail: the cut of the bodice, the drape of the skirt, the length and arrangement of the train that swept behind her, the veil that framed her face. These descriptions served readers who would never see the actual garments, but who consumed such accounts with the same appetite they brought to fiction, imagining themselves into scenes of luxury and romance. Her gloves were white kid leather, buttoned at the wrist with the tiny closures that required careful attention to fasten properly. They would be removed at the appropriate moment during the celebration. Etiquette dictated precisely when gloves should be worn and when removed, and a bride's gloves followed their own particular protocol. The simple act of pulling off those gloves, laying them aside for the wedding dinner, enacted a ritual of transition that everyone present understood. The debutante becoming wife, the girl becoming woman, the private individual taking on a public name and role. Under the chandeliers of Beechwood's ballroom, Madeleine stepped into a name that had defined American aristocracy for generations. The Astors were not merely wealthy, they were a dynasty, their fortune and position stretching back to the early republic, their name synonymous with the kind of established wealth that newer fortunes, the Vanderbilts, the Carnegies, the Rockefellers, aspired to match. To become Mrs. John Jacob Astor Beaufort was to assume a position that came with expectations, obligations, and scrutiny that the name itself guaranteed. Outside the mansion, critics continued to murmur their disapproval. The age difference, the divorce, the unseemly speed of the courtship all provided material for those who found fault with the match. Society's verdict was mixed at best. Some doors would open for the new Mrs. Astor that had been closed to Madeleine Force, but others would remain shut, their keepers unwilling to accept a second wife, regardless of her beauty or breeding. The compromise of a Congregationalist ceremony rather than an Episcopal one had already marked the union as somehow irregular, somehow outside the full blessing of the establishment that both families claimed to represent. Inside Beechwood, the orchestra played, and the ceremony proceeded, according to scripts refined over generations of society weddings. Every element had its prescribed form: the order of the bridal procession, the placement of guests according to precedence and relationship, the wording of the service, the exchange of vows and rings. After the ceremony, a wedding breakfast followed, with its own elaborate protocols: the seating arrangements, the sequence of courses, the toasts and responses, the cutting of the cake, the formal removal of gloves before the meal. The rituals promised stability, continuity, the reassuring repetition of forms that had governed such occasions for as long as anyone could remember. They masked, as such rituals always do, the fragility beneath, the uncertainty of any human union, the impossibility of predicting what the future would bring. When Madeleine signed the register as Madeleine Astor, her signature linked her not only to a husband she may or may not have loved. The historical record preserves no intimate letters, no diary entries that might reveal her private feelings, but to a legal and financial structure stretching far beyond Beechwood's elegant rooms. The documents drafted by lawyers in the months before the wedding, the trusts and provisions and conditions that would govern her access to the Astor fortune, had already begun to define her future. The next voyage would test how much protection all that legal architecture could actually provide. In January 1912, scarcely 4 months after their wedding at Beechwood, the newlyweds sailed from New York aboard the RMS Olympic, beginning an extended honeymoon. that would take them through Europe and into Egypt in the grand tour tradition that wealthy Americans had adopted from their British counterparts. The journey reflected both the possibilities and the conventions of their class. Travel as education and display, as escape from domestic scrutiny, as announcement of membership in an international elite who move freely across borders and oceans. The Olympic was the sister ship of the soon-to-be-launched Titanic, one of the White Star Line's great vessels that represented the pinnacle of Edwardian maritime technology and luxury. First-class accommodations rivaled the finest hotels, with suites and staterooms decorated in period styles, dining rooms whose service matched the best restaurants of Paris or London, and amenities that transformed an ocean crossing from mere transportation into a social experience in its own right. For passengers like the Astors, transatlantic travel was simply another setting for the performance of wealth and status, another stage on which their position would be witnessed and confirmed. Egypt had become a fashionable destination for wealthy travelers in the decades since the British colonial administration had opened the country to tourism. The pyramids at Giza, the temples at Luxor and Karnak, the Valley of the Kings with its recently discovered royal tombs. These ancient sites drew visitors who combined genuine archaeological interest with the desire to acquire experiences that distinguished them from less adventurous travelers. Luxury hotels along the Nile, steamships that carried tourists from site to site in comfort, local guides who had learned to cater to European and American expectations, all these supported an industry of cultural tourism that allowed the wealthy to encounter ancient civilization without sacrificing modern convenience. The Astors traveled in the style their position demanded. They stayed at the best hotels, employed local guides, viewed antiquities that most Americans knew only from photographs and museum displays. The desert light falling on ancient stone, the otherness of Cairo's streets and Alexandria's harbor, the sense of touching history that Egyptian travel provided. All these experiences offered the newlyweds something their life in New York and Newport could not: distance from the social pressures that had surrounded their courtship and wedding, space to begin their married life away from the judgmental eyes of American society. By early April 1912, the extended honeymoon was drawing toward its close. Madeleine was approximately 5 months pregnant, her condition advancing to the point where transatlantic travel would soon become inadvisable. She wanted to give birth in America, surrounded by family and the familiar medical care that her position afforded. Not in European hotels, however luxurious, or on shipboard, however comfortable. The decision to return home was practical and prudent, driven by the biological realities that even great wealth could not override. Their choice of ship for the homeward voyage, RMS Titanic, the newest and largest of the White Star Line's vessels, embarking from Southampton, England, on 10 April 1912, announced their status as clearly as their Newport address or their Fifth Avenue mansion. Titanic had been the subject of intense publicity since before her launch, promoted as the finest ocean liner ever built, virtually unsinkable in her design, the last word in maritime luxury and technological achievement. Her maiden voyage attracted passengers whose collective wealth and prominence earned the crossing the nickname Millionaire's Special. The passenger list read like an index of the era's great fortunes and famous names: Benjamin Guggenheim of the mining and smelting dynasty, Isidor Straus, co-owner of Macy's department store, traveling with his wife Ida, George Widener, heir to a Philadelphia streetcar fortune, John B. Thayer, a Pennsylvania railroad executive. These and dozens of other prominent figures had secured first-class accommodations on the celebrated maiden voyage. The Astors joined the Olympic at Cherbourg, France, where tenders ferried passengers to the great liner anchored offshore. First-class accommodations on Titanic exceeded even those of her sister ship Olympic. The Astors occupied one of the ship's most luxurious suites, appointed with period furniture and decorated to resemble a private residence rather than a cabin. They had brought with them a retinue appropriate to their station: Madeleine's maid, Rosalie Bidois, Colonel Astor's valet, Victor Robbins, his manservant, and the couple's dog, an Airedale named Kitty who traveled in the ship's kennel. Their luggage filled multiple trunks, including the wardrobe Madeleine would need for formal dinners in the first-class dining saloon, and the social occasions that shipboard life among the elite provided. The honeymoon itinerary, so carefully planned to showcase wealth and taste and the pleasures of married life among the international set, would soon be preserved not in society columns but in survivor lists and inquiry transcripts. The trunks of elegant clothing, the gowns packed for formal dinners, the gloves meant for promenades on deck and tea in the Palm Court, all would be lost to the Atlantic. What survived would be something quite different: testimony, memory, grief, and the legal documents whose provisions would shape a young widow's life. On the night of 14th April 1912, approximately 4 days into Titanic's maiden voyage, the great liner struck an iceberg at 11:40 p.m. ship's time in the North Atlantic, roughly 400 miles south of Newfoundland. The collision occurred during a calm, clear night when the sea was unusually flat and the stars burned bright in a moonless sky, conditions that, ironically, made iceberg detection more difficult, since there was no wave action to reveal the presence of ice through breaking water. In their first-class suite, the Astors were preparing for, or perhaps already retired to bed when the collision occurred. Passengers throughout the ship felt the impact differently depending on their location. Some described a shuddering crash, others a grinding vibration. Still others barely noticed anything at all. The initial reactions were more curious than alarmed. Passengers emerged from cabins to see what had happened, found the promenade decks, peered over the railings, trying to glimpse whatever the ship had struck. According to testimony later given at both the American and British inquiries into the disaster, Colonel Astor approached Captain Edward John Smith to ask whether he should wake his wife and prepare her for possible danger. The captain reportedly advised him to do so, an early indication that the ship's officers understood sooner than most passengers the seriousness of the situation. The impact had opened the Titanic's hull below the waterline along nearly a third of her length. The unsinkable ship was, in fact, sinking, and nothing could prevent it. Colonel Astor helped Madeleine into a cork life jacket, the bulky flotation devices that passengers were required to wear as the evacuation began. He reassured her, according to survivor accounts, that the damage did not seem serious, that they would likely be returning to their cabin before long. Whether he believed this himself or was simply trying to calm a young pregnant wife facing a terrifying situation, the historical record does not reveal. At one point during the confused hours between the collision and the final sinking, the couple was seen in the ship's gymnasium, both wearing their life jackets, sitting incongruously on the mechanical horses and rowing machines that were part of the ship's fitness equipment. Other passengers later recalled seeing them there, waiting, perhaps trying to stay out of the way while the crew struggled to launch lifeboats. The confusion of those hours, barely 2.5 hours elapsed between the collision and the ship's final plunge, would become the subject of extensive investigation and enduring controversy. There were not enough lifeboats for all passengers and crew. The boats that existed were not filled to capacity. The evacuation proceeded chaotically, with different officers enforcing different standards about who could board. On the port side of the ship, Second Officer Charles Lytler enforced a strict interpretation of the women and children first order, permitting no men into the boats regardless of circumstances. On the starboard side, First Officer William Murdoch allowed men to board when no women were waiting. Colonel Astor helped his wife toward Lifeboat 4, which was being loaded from the promenade deck, passengers climbing through windows that had been opened for the purpose. As Madeleine prepared to board, accompanied by her maid Rosalie Bidois and her nurse Caroline Andre, Colonel Astor asked Second Officer Lytler if he might be permitted to accompany his wife, given her pregnant condition. Lytler refused. The rule was women and children only. No men would be permitted while women remained on board. The exchange was witnessed by Archibald Gracie, a military historian and first-class passenger who survived the sinking and later testified before the United States Senate inquiry. Colonel Astor reportedly accepted the refusal without protest. He stepped back from the window through which his wife was climbing, called out some words. Different survivors remembered different versions, perhaps asking her which lifeboat she was entering, perhaps reassuring her that he would see her soon. Then he receded into the crowd of men remaining on the listing deck, and she did not see him again. Madeleine left the ship gloved and veiled, 19 years old and 5 months pregnant with a child who would never know his father. She was lowered toward the black water in a lifeboat that was not full, past the rows of portholes still lit from within, past the great hull that was already beginning its final descent. The lights of the Titanic remained burning almost to the end, giving the surreal impression of a great hotel sinking into the sea. From the lifeboat, she watched her husband's figure recede among the thousands of passengers and crew who remained aboard, most of whom would be dead within 2 hours. In the accounts that survive, Senate testimony, newspaper interviews, statements issued through family spokesmen, Madeleine's own voice comes filtered through layers of mediation. The girl who had been trained all her life to speak perfectly, to present herself with poise and self-possession, now survived in other people's sentences, her experience of that night recorded by others. Her grief expressed through formal statements drafted by lawyers and trustees. What she actually thought and felt, the terror and confusion and loss of those hours, remained largely private, protected by the same social training that had taught her never to reveal too much. Rescued by the RMS Carpathia after hours drifting in the freezing darkness, surrounded by the bodies of the dead and the cries of the dying, Madeleine Astor arrived in New York on the evening of 18th April 1912. The Carpathia had raced through the night to reach the disaster site, arriving too late to save most of those in the water but in time to pull survivors from lifeboats. The returning ship docked at Pier 54 in Manhattan, where thousands of people had gathered, family members desperate for news, reporters seeking stories, the merely curious drawn by the magnitude of the tragedy. Madeleine came down the gangway not to the anonymity she desperately needed, but to the glare of flashbulbs and the shouted questions of journalists. Her husband's body had been recovered from the Atlantic. He was among the most prominent victims of the disaster, his death making headlines around the world. But her grief would not be permitted the privacy that ordinary mourners could expect. She was the young widow of one of the richest men in America, survivor of the most sensational maritime catastrophe in history, and the press interest was overwhelming and inescapable. Her public statements in the days and weeks following the disaster came not in her own voice but filtered through intermediaries. Nicholas Biddle, a trustee of the Astor estate, served as the family's spokesman, issuing formal communications that translated whatever Madeleine actually felt into language deemed appropriate for public consumption. The training she had received all her life, the composure, the self-control, the measured expression that revealed nothing, now served to erase her individual response entirely, replacing it with the careful phrases that lawyers and family advisors considered suitable for a young widow of her position. The legal aftermath of Colonel Astor's death began almost immediately. His will, drafted and revised over years but most recently updated after his remarriage, became a document of intense public interest. In May 1912, newspapers reported extensively on its provisions, analyzing the distribution of an estate estimated at approximately $85 million, with the same fascination they had devoted to the sinking itself. The coverage revealed not merely the disposition of wealth, but the family dynamics and social calculations that had shaped the document. The vast majority of Colonel Astor's fortune passed to Vincent Astor, his 20-year-old son from his first marriage, who now became one of the wealthiest young men in America. Additional provisions secured the interests of Ava Astor, his daughter, also from the first marriage. These arrangements reflected standard practice among wealthy families, the preservation of dynastic wealth across generations, the protection of existing heirs against the claims of subsequent spouses. Madeleine, 19 years old, newly widowed, and pregnant with a child her husband would never see, received provisions that were generous by any ordinary standard but modest relative to the total estate. $100,000 came to her outright, immediately available without conditions. The income from a $5 million trust would support her during widowhood, a substantial annual sum that guaranteed comfort and security. She also received the use of the family's principal residences, the mansion at 840 Fifth Avenue in New York and Beechwood, the Newport cottage where she had been married barely 7 months earlier. But these provisions came attached to a condition that would govern her choices for years. They remained hers only so long as she did not remarry. If she married again, she would immediately forfeit the trust income and the right to occupy the Astor houses. The Fifth Avenue mansion and Beechwood would revert to the estate. The $5 million trust would pass to other beneficiaries. A young widow who chose to pursue love or companionship, who refused to spend the rest of her life in mourning for a man she had known less than 2 years, would lose nearly everything the will provided. A separate trust of $3 million was established for any child born after Colonel Astor's death, the baby Madeleine carried, who would enter the world already wealthy, already famous, already the subject of public fascination. This posthumous child provision was standard estate planning language, but in the circumstances of April 1912, it carried extraordinary weight. The child would be named John Jacob Astor Heiress, another link in a dynasty that now stretched across more than a century of American history. On paper, Madeleine Astor was extraordinarily provided for. The $100,000, the trust income, the use of 2 of the most prestigious addresses in America. These guaranteed a life of luxury that most women could never imagine. In practice, the will transformed her widowhood into a kind of contract, an ongoing agreement whose terms she had not negotiated and could not modify. To love again, to marry again, to build a new life with a new partner would cost her not just money but home and position and the social standing that came with the Astor name. Privilege had become conditional, written in legal clauses rather than wedding vows. The same hands that had once drawn her gloves snug before entering a ballroom now signed receipts for trust income that would vanish if she exercised the freedom to choose her own future. On 14th of August 1912 at 840 Fifth Avenue in New York City, surrounded by the luxury that her husband's will had conditionally provided, Madeleine Astor gave birth to a son. The child was immediately named John Jacob Astor Sicko, continuing a naming tradition that stretched back through generations of the family, and almost immediately nicknamed by newspapers the Titanic baby, a label that would follow him throughout his life, marking him always as the posthumous child of one of the disaster's most famous victims. The birth was covered as a major news event, the latest chapter in a story that readers had followed through courtship, wedding, honeymoon, disaster, and now continuation. Reporters camped outside the Fifth Avenue mansion, filing dispatches about the baby's weight and health, speculating about his future inheritance, reminding readers of the tragedy that had made him fatherless before he was born. The child entered the world already public property, his existence transformed into narrative for mass consumption before he could open his eyes. For the next several years, Madeleine raised her son within the structures and constraints that the Astor estate had established. She spent summer seasons at Beechwood in Newport, the mansion where she had been married and which she now occupied as a condition of her widowhood. The ballroom that had witnessed her wedding in September 1911 now framed quieter family occasions, birthdays and holidays, the small celebrations appropriate to a house in mourning. The great rooms where Caroline Astor had once received the 400 now served as playroom and nursery for a fatherless child, their grandeur somewhat diminished by the absence of the elaborate entertainments they had been designed to host. During the rest of the year, Madeleine occupied the Fifth Avenue mansion, another spectacular residence that she held not as owner but as conditional tenant. Servants maintained the house. The Astor name opened doors throughout New York society. Money from the trust supported a lifestyle of comfort and security, but everything depended on her continued widowhood, her performance of grief and fidelity to a man she had known barely 18 months. She lived, as newspaper accounts noted with approval, in strict retirement during the first years after the disaster. A young widow was expected to withdraw from society, to curtail entertainments and avoid gaiety. to demonstrate through her seclusion the depth of her loss and the permanence of her attachment to her husband's memory. The elaborate mourning customs of the Victorian era had begun to relax by 1912, but expectations remained. Black clothing for the first year, subdued colors afterward, limited participation in social events, a general demeanor of dignified grief. Her first significant public appearance after the disaster came in May 1912, barely a month after returning to the Carpathia, when she hosted a luncheon at her Fifth Avenue home honoring Captain Arthur Rostron, the man who had commanded the rescue ship, and Dr. Frank McGee, the Carpathia's surgeon. Fellow survivor Marion Thayer, whose husband had also perished in the sinking, joined her for this gesture of gratitude toward the men who had saved their lives. The event required deploying all the social skills Madeleine had cultivated since childhood. Invitations had to be written on proper stationery, in proper form. Guests had to be received with appropriate warmth, neither too effusive nor too reserved. Remarks of thanks had to balance personal emotion with public propriety, acknowledging gratitude without dissolving into the unseemly displays that a lady's training forbade. All the tools of her education, the correspondence, the deportment, the controlled expression, the timing of gloves removed and replaced, were now employed to navigate grief reshaped by public expectation and perform before audiences who would judge every detail. In society photographs from these years, she appears impeccably dressed and groomed, often gloved in the formal settings where gloves were still required. Her expression is composed, her posture correct, her entire presentation conforming to the model of dignified young widowhood that her world expected and rewarded. Whatever she actually felt, the anger that might reasonably accompany such losses, the loneliness of maintaining great houses without a partner, the frustration of conditions that turned her life into a kind of gilded imprisonment, remained invisible beneath the polished surface that years of training had made second nature. Within the Astor houses, she had status without sovereignty, comfort without genuine control over her own future. Her security depended entirely on remaining exactly as the will prescribed, widowed, alone, faithful to a dead man's memory, as defined not by her own heart, but by lawyers and trustees who managed the estate's affairs. The first genuine assertion of her own agency, the first choice that prioritized her desires over the conditions imposed upon her, would cost nearly everything the will had promised to provide. In 1916, 5 years after her first wedding and 4 years after her first husband's death, Madeleine Astor made a decision that would transform her circumstances entirely and irrevocably. She married William Carl Dick, a childhood friend who had become a banker and businessman, a man closer to her own age whose social position, while respectable, was far removed from the Astor stratosphere. The wedding was quiet, almost secretive, lacking entirely the Newport grandeur and society coverage that had attended her first marriage. There were no breathless descriptions of her gown in fashion columns, no guest lists parsed by social correspondents, no photographs reproduced in newspapers across the country. The contrast with September 1911 could not have been more complete, and the reason was obvious to everyone who understood the terms of Colonel Astor's will. The moment Madeleine signed the marriage register as Madeleine Dick, the conditional provisions of her first husband's estate activated precisely as his lawyers had designed. She immediately forfeited the income from the $5 million trust that had supported her widowhood, approximately $200,000 annually, a sum that would have maintained most families in luxury for generations. She surrendered the right to occupy the Fifth Avenue mansion, the great house where she had given birth to her son, where she had hosted the luncheon thanking Captain Rostron, where she had lived as the widow Astor for 4 years. She surrendered Beechwood as well, the Newport cottage where she had been married, where she had spent summers with her child, where the memory of her first husband's family was embodied in every room. The legal structure Colonel Astor's attorneys had constructed to keep her in place, to ensure that his fortune and his name would not be carried into another man's household, worked exactly as intended. To marry again, to choose love or companionship, or simply escape from the isolation of perpetual widowhood, she had to let the fortune and the mansions go. The arithmetic was stark and unavoidable. Marriage meant renouncing nearly everything except the $100,000 outright bequest and whatever goodwill remained between her and the Astor family. The choice revealed something about Madeleine that the polished surface of her training had carefully concealed: a willingness to sacrifice security for autonomy, to step outside the script that others had written for her, to accept diminishment in exchange for the freedom to make her own decisions. Whether she loved William Dick passionately, or simply preferred any husband to the golden captivity of Astor widowhood, the historical record does not clearly reveal. What is documented is that she chose, and that the choice cost her dearly. With Dick, she had two sons, William Force Dick and John Henry Dick II, expanding her family even as her Astor-derived financial independence contracted. The marriage appears to have been reasonably happy, or at least stable. It lasted until Dick's death, giving her years of whatever domestic contentment or ordinary difficulty private life contained. She had traded one kind of existence for another, exchanging spectacular wealth and prestigious addresses for something more modest, but more genuinely her own. Her connection to the Astor family attenuated, but did not entirely disappear. Her son, John Jacob Astor Sixgill, retained his trust fund and his famous name, ties that kept Madeleine connected to the world she had left. But she was no longer Mrs. Astor of Fifth Avenue and Beechwood. She was Mrs. Dick, wife of a banker, mother of three sons, resident of less magnificent addresses. In 1933, as the Great Depression devastated fortunes and Newport's Gilded Age waned into irrelevance, Madeleine married for a third time. Her new husband was Enzo Fiermonte, an Italian professional boxer whose background and occupation could hardly have been more different from the world of Fifth Avenue mansions and society balls. The marriage provocation outweighed whatever happiness it provided. It was controversial, widely criticized, and ultimately unsuccessful, ending in divorce. Whether she sought in Fiermonte something that neither Astor nor Dick had provided, excitement, passion, escape from the conventions that had shaped her entire life, or whether the marriage represented a mistake born of loneliness or poor judgment, the record does not say. On 27th of March 1940, Madeleine Talmadge Force Astor, Dick Fiermonte, died in Palm Beach, Florida, far from the icy North Atlantic waters where her first husband had perished, far from the great houses of Bellevue Avenue where she had once smoothed her gloves before walking into a ballroom to become Mrs. John Jacob Astor IV. She was 46 years old, had been married 3 times, had borne 3 sons, and raised them through decades of dramatic change, had experienced heights of privilege and depths of loss that few lives encompassed. The girl who had been trained to perform social roles with perfect composure had ultimately refused to perform the role that a dead man's will had assigned her. Today, visitors walk through the restored Newport mansions that once formed the stage for Gilded Age society, Beechwood among them, the Breakers, and Marble House, and Rosecliff, and the others, and pause before photographs and displays documenting an era of extraordinary wealth and equally extraordinary constraint. Docents explain how the summer season organized social life, how invitations and seating arrangements could make or break reputations, how marriage among the elite operated as alliance building rather than romance. The great rooms where Caroline Astor once received the 400 now receive tourists who marvel at the scale of opulence and wonder about the lives lived within these walls. In Titanic museums and exhibitions scattered around the world, Belfast, where the ship was built, Southampton, where she sailed, Las Vegas and Orlando, and traveling exhibitions that have drawn millions of visitors, they encounter the story of the disaster that claimed more than 1,500 lives. The passenger lists are reproduced, the names and faces of those who sailed, and those who survived, and those who perished displayed for contemplation. Among the photographs, visitors find images of a very young woman in flawless white gloves, her expression composed, her posture perfect, her future about to be reshaped by forces entirely beyond her control or comprehension. The photographs show Madeleine at 18 and 19, Slim and beautiful, trained in all the graces that her era valued in upper-class women, they show the careful posture that hours of practice had instilled, the controlled expression that revealed nothing of inner experience, the arrangements of hair and dress that announced breeding and wealth to knowing observers. They show her at the apex of a social system designed to transform wealthy daughters into ornamental wives, to channel female energy and capability into domestic display and social performance, to make women's lives instruments of family strategy rather than vehicles for individual aspiration. They show, in other words, both the beauty and the constraint that defined her world and countless women like her. What the photographs cannot show is everything that came after: the decision to remarry and forfeit a fortune, the scandal of a third marriage to a boxer, the quiet years in Palm Beach far from the scenes of her fame and tragedy. They cannot reveal whether she regretted her choices or celebrated them, whether she mourned the mansions she had surrendered or felt relief at their loss, whether the freedom she purchased was worth the price she paid to obtain it. The historical record preserves surfaces and public events, not the inner lives that gave them meaning. The photographs preserve a moment, a young woman about to become Mrs. Astor, or a young widow returning from the sea, or a mother holding her fatherless son. They do not reveal what she thought as she posed, what she hoped or feared, what she understood about the system that had shaped her, or the choices that would eventually transform her circumstances. The cameras captured her image, the society columns recorded her movements, the legal documents fixed her options. But Madeleine herself remains elusive, visible in every frame but never fully known. In one image from her wedding day at Beechwood, she stands in her bridal gown before the assembled guests, white kid gloves visible on her hands, her expression serene as training demands. The gesture that had signified perfect breeding and careful attention to social codes, fingers smoothing a seam of fine leather, adjusting the tiny buttons at the wrist, now reads differently across the distance of more than a century. It appears as a small, controlled movement within a structure she did not design, performed by a woman whose education had prepared her to inhabit roles rather than create them, to respond rather than initiate, to please rather than choose. Yet she would ultimately dare to step beyond that structure, accepting the consequences of agency in a world that had not prepared her for independence. The gloves she wore that September day have long vanished, along with the Newport mansion and the Fifth Avenue house, and all the elaborate architecture of Gilded Age privilege that had formed her and constrained her, and ultimately could not contain her. What remains is the story: a girl trained to perform, a woman who survived, a widow who chose, and the images that preserve her face across time for viewers who will never know her but cannot look away. The hands that once smoothed those gloves made their own choices, at their own cost, in their own time.